Hello, everybody. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here with you. I am coming to you from a little WeWork office in Miami right now, where my wife and I had to travel for some work stuff. So anyway, sorry for the weird lighting and like the ghostly nature, and also if I'm slightly what's the word? If I'm slightly dazed, it's because of the time change. Really happy to be here with you all. My name is Kevin Liban. I'm the founder of TechTonic Justice, but I come to this work after over a dozen years as a legal aid attorney at an LSC funded program in Arkansas, Legal Aid of Arkansas. There is no unrestricted program in the state. And so I'm going to talk to you today about, AI related issues and the way that they harm our client communities, and really get into the nitty gritty and also some about how to fight it and all of these other important things for folks on the ground, like yourselves. A couple quick logistical things is if there is a clarifying question, please pop it in the Q&A. As soon as you have it, I'd love to clear up if there's a concept, if there's a term I use, if there's an acronym that I don't define, that has you wondering what exactly is he talking about. Please go ahead and pop that in there so we can address that right away. If there's something that is more substantive, let's hold that for the end. We have an hour and a half together today, and I build in ample time for us to have a nice discussion. And whatever you're thinking, please know somebody else is thinking, and so feel free to ask it whether or not you have any, particular knowledge with regards to artificial intelligence or not. There are only good questions. So with that said, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Um, and let's see here. That is not the way. I will blame that on the time zone change. Here we are. And Yoselin was so kind to make sure that I had all this practiced before I joined. So there we go. So innovating in justice, how AI harms low-income communities. Also, let me thank LAAC very much, Yoselin and Kasha for um, helping to organize this. Very grateful. And for all of you who are here in attendance, I now live in Reseda in the San Fernando Valley. So if there's anything today that leads you to want to meet up at some point, to talk, to do something in person, to meet with a community group you guys are connected to, feel free to let me know. Also, I'm from the Bay originally, so always glad for excuses to head back up that way. All right, let's start with hope in the present moment. So first, I want to start with hope, and namely that this stuff can be fought and defeated. And that's the way I come to this work. So the year is 2016. I started practicing in fall of 2011. So at this point, I'm, 4 years in, kind of the point that you get dangerous, right? Where you're not constantly questioning every moment of every day with every client, whether you're competent, whether you're missing something that's going to devastate their lives, and all of these things. And up to now, my specialty is public benefits of all sorts. It's employment law, discrimination, protected concerted activity, wage theft, special education for kids with disabilities, and then also a lot of domestic violence work. So those are my areas of specialty. And in January of 2016, I would receive, myself and my team at Legal Aid of Arkansas, would receive 24 calls about a Medicaid program that in my previous 4 years combined, maybe we received a total of 10 or 12 calls on. And what folks were calling about was something really interesting, urgent, and frankly awful. People were on a Medicaid home and community-based services program. And for those of you who don't practice Medicaid or HCBS stuff in particular, what these do is they provide in-home care services for people who would otherwise have to be institutionalized in places like nursing facilities. The whole notion is you provide somebody care at home, it's better for their independence, their dignity, and it's also generally much cheaper for the state and federal government than a nursing facility or other institution. And these folks were all calling. Many had been on the program for years, sometimes a decade, more. And they were saying that after this time on the program, receiving a certain number of hours per day, their hours were being cut drastically. And they didn't know why. So to give you an example, the maximum daily amount of care in Arkansas at the time was 8 hours per day. Now, for you, those of you in California, that's probably laughable. And in many other states, it's laughable because everybody knows 8 hours a day isn't enough to meet your actual care needs, particularly if you have quadriplegia or cerebral palsy or multiple sclerosis or various other kind of ongoing conditions that don't get better. But in Arkansas, that was the maximum, and people had been doing their best to make do as they could. You know, you schedule someone 3 hours in the morning to help you get out of bed and get your breakfast and bathe, and 2 hours in the afternoon for lunch and some chores around the house, and then a couple hours in the evening to help you get back into bed and prepare dinner and all the other things that need to happen. And that's how people had been making it work. Suddenly, their hours are getting cut from 8 to like 5 a day or 4.5 a day of care, or even people who had been receiving fewer hours, like people who had been getting 4 hours a day of care or 3 hours a day of care, were now getting their care cut in half. And what this meant for folks was absolute devastation. People would end up lying in their own waste. They would get bed sores from not being turned. They would risk falls trying to get up and use the bathroom or prepare themselves a meal. They would skip meals. They would miss physical therapy appointments that kept their mobility, whatever mobility they had in limbs that were otherwise losing it, just suffering at a huge scale. Um, and they didn't know why. And so all of those clients who called us would ask the nurse that had came out to assess that had come out to assess them, why? You know, in many cases, this was the same nurse that had come out the year before and approved whatever number of hours they were getting. What's changed? Why is this different? Why are you cutting my care? And the nurse would give some sort of version of this answer. It's not me, it's the computer. So we have a couple dozen clients calling us with this very issue with some variant of this line, and we're like, something is funny here. Now, this is 2016. Algorithm is not even a common word in parlance, right? When media stories would eventually report on this, they would have to say, oh, the algorithm is the reason that Facebook or Instagram is showing you cat videos, right? Like it wasn't a common phrase of speech. But at the time, I understood that this might be what's going on. There's something funny happening here. We investigated. We found out that sure enough, the state had, with no public notice, implemented an algorithm that completely removed the discretion that nurses had to decide the amount of care people received. And the algorithm was the sole factor. Um, we knew from past dealings with our state that they were not going to be cooperative about this, not something you can just kind of talk through. Nobody in Arkansas had a strong tradition of affirmative litigation. I don't think anyone from either of the state's legal aid programs had sued the state affirmatively in like 30 years. So we just decided right out of the gate, let's go. And so we filed a suit in federal court on due process grounds. We ended up winning. The judge put it on a fast track. We went from filing the complaint to trial within 6 months, which, I mean, I am also a federal litigator. That is unheard of. After we won on due process grounds, we thought, oh, okay, maybe the state will be chastened, right? Maybe they'll be reflective. They'll understand the harms better. They'll know that we can come at them, and they will think about making system-wide program improvements. I couldn't have been more wrong. They just dug in harder. And so we were like, all right, let's go, right? And at this point, I recognized, because of what claims were available to us, that the law was only going to get us so far, right? Like maybe we can stop, we can slow things down, we can invalidate the system until they fix the procedural deficiencies. But in terms of substantively bettering the program or getting rid of the algorithm, it wasn't going to do to just rest on litigation. And so we very intentionally, within full LSC regulations, by the way, undertook a massive public education, community activation, and narrative strategy campaign. And let me here say, this is a little bit of an aside, but if you are in a program that says, nah, we can't do something because of LSC regs, there are some cases where that's true. But most of the time where I hear that, it is bogus. Like if you master the regs, you set up procedures and processes to make sure that you're falling within them, and then you execute on that, you can do a whole lot more than is permissible, or than people would claim is permissible. And if you're ever in that position and need to justify to your superiors, or you are a superior who's trying to reconfigure that, let me know. I'm happy to work with you on that. Anyway, long story short, we had amazing success. We had clients who were helping each other survive assessments, like, oh, watch out for this question. This is how they get you, right? Or this question really matters. Make sure you pay attention to that. We had people sharing their stories. We produced videos of clients' lives with their full consent and ethical practices that then other clients could share and say, oh, this is what's happening to me. And they ended up sharing that with, oftentimes with state legislators that they were connected to or were in, similar communities with or networks with. We had people showing up at administrative rulemaking hearings and legislative hearings, bringing their story and bringing the stories of folks who couldn't travel to make the meeting. We had just in public comments for Medicaid rules, Arkansas is a state of 3 million. If there was ever a Medicaid promulgated rule, usually you'd get between 8 and 13 comments, most of those from like the regulated industry, the Medicaid providers. We ended up generating something like 90 comments that were all against the algorithm and all had a little bit of a different flavor to them. Um, Rooted in personal stories. We had several media stories about it that ended up kind of blowing things up both at the state level and at the national level. And we had success. We won in the courts, and we convinced the legislature of Arkansas, which is not known for its benevolence, that this was too cruel even for them, right? And so they ended up at the end of 2018 abandoning this algorithm in favor of a new program that was less algorithmically complex. It had a different set of losers. I'm happy to talk about that. We ended up having to sue them in their individual capacities. We pierced qualified immunity. We got a 3-0 decision from the Eighth Circuit and ended up getting damages for our clients and a settlement that improved things globally. But that's kind of part two of the saga. Part one of the saga, just getting rid of this first algorithm, is where we're going to focus now. And so I offer that as hope because I want you all to know at the jump that even though this might be a new area, it's certainly got a steep learning curve. It's hard. Your folks are going to be experiencing a lot of suffering along the way, that there is something that can be done. This can be successful. And that's actually the genesis of tectonic justice, is after this win, I started getting calls from advocates in other states, advocates in other countries saying, hey, we heard you dealt with this thing. Can you help us? And with many other friends, particularly folks at the National Health Law Program and Upturn, which is sort of a tech justice think and do tank, we started to work together to actually provide resources and bolster the ability of advocates to fight this stuff. And even with that, there was a recognition that that wasn't enough, and there's problems, and it's not just public benefits. And we need to do two things with regards to this emerging threat of AI. We need to help people reduce the harm they experience and survive the suffering. And we also need to build power amongst communities to achieve long-lasting change. And that's the thing in Arkansas we didn't have at the beginning. We had this, or we didn't have at the end, is we had this amazingly activated community of advocates that had developed their leadership, that were comfortable in so many different forums, and we had nowhere to connect them to. There was no broader movement of kind of established tech justice. Here's how you can channel this energy and experience you have, or here's how you can help other people in other states survive something like this, or here's how you can contribute what you learned to a fight that may be different from you. So tectonic justice exists on both these fronts: help people survive the harms and then build power to achieve long-lasting change. This hope is really important in light of the present moment because if you weren't already aware, artificial intelligence is the way that now the present administration is pursuing so many of its destructive aims. I know there are folks on here who are from LSC funded programs. Nothing I'm saying is, would run afoul of those regs. You're not participating in anything that's even runs close to the line. But without delving too deep into politics, I just want to highlight AI's role in a lot of things. The destruction of the federal government through DOGE efforts was fueled by AI. It might have been a very simple form of AI, but it was there and it was present. The talk about using AI to replace government capacity, I mean, one, it's bogus factually, but it's also part of this project to destroy and remake government capacity so that it can't really serve people well. Also now, with the ongoing abduction of people regardless of citizenship or documented status, AI is fueling, through data aggregation, is fueling the identification of people for basically abduction. And today, the administration announced an AI plan that's going to mean exposing low-income communities to further threats of environmental degradation through the development of data centers. It means going to be having no so-called guardrails on what the federal government or state governments can do with respect to AI. And so now is the moment that we have to fight. And I want to foreground this conversation with the hope and the urgency while we move into some of the practicalities of how you, as legal aid attorneys, can help your individual clients, either individually or systemically, to fight this stuff. So what is AI? One, if you're having that conversation significantly, it may not be with somebody who's acting in good faith. Just want you to know that up front. Like, you don't have to get caught up on this. Now, of course, if there's a statute that we're defining AI, then definitions matter a lot. There isn't one for the most part that matters extensively. California is a little different because of the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, I think it is. Um, but for the most part, when we're talking about AI, I'm using a broad definition, a machine-based system that for given objectives and inputs can generate outputs that involve oftentimes predictions, recommendations, or decisions. This is the definition of the international body known as the OECD. It's broad, and the reason I favor a broad definition, sometimes somebody would be like, oh, but does that mean my Excel spreadsheet or spell check is AI? And like, that's not the question that we really should be answering. When we're talking about AI decision making, right? When somebody, generally with power, a government official, a landlord, an employer, someone like this is using AI to make a decision, that's where the problematic or is using, yeah, that's where the problem arises. And from our client's perspective, oftentimes it doesn't matter how technically sophisticated the system is. It could be simple data matching software in some ways that compares the data that the state knows you have versus income limits. If that isn't working well, it is just as opaque and hidden as whatever the latest large language model might be doing with respect to something that it's generating. So from our client's perspective, the sophistication often doesn't matter. So I want you, whatever your familiarity with kind of AI coming into this, to know that you don't need to get hung up on the technical side of things too much, okay? Where is it used to make decisions? This is really the meat of the presentation. This graph is super cool, but I'm not going to make you all understand it right now because it took me even some time when I was working with folks to design it. Um, so there's explanations. I'll let you go through that in the PowerPoint later. The most important thing about this slide is just it estimates the number of people who are subjected to AI-based decision making in any one given program or issue area, right? So on the high end, you have 73 million low-income people on Medicaid. That's everybody on Medicaid is probably exposed to AI decision making in one way or another. And then on the low end, you have child welfare. Now, this is by far an underestimate. Like I know LA County in I think it's the Lancaster, Palmdale area, has been toying with child welfare systems that are based on AI. But 72,000 people on the minimum across the country would be subjected to it. So that's all this chart is showing you right now. If you're really interested, feel free later on to delve deeper in. What we're going to do now is turn to each of these issue areas and kind of talk about very specific use cases that are in there. Public benefits, every aspect. Eligibility determination, certainly if it's income or asset-based, and excuse me, generally if there's some sort of like need-based component to it. For example, in the Medicaid case that I had, or in determinations of how much of a benefit you're going to get that's beyond a sort of a simple calculation in most cases. Fraud detection is a huge one. There's an infamous story out of Michigan in the 2010s. Michigan's unemployment system implemented an algorithmic tool called Midas that definitely did not search anything to gold, right? It was the opposite, to detect the unemployment fraud of UI claimants. And the system accused over 40,000 people of committing UI fraud. Now, once those accusations were lodged, there wasn't meaningful due process. It was finalized. Those folks were assessed a penalty of the amount of UI benefits they received and 400% of that. So this drove people to regularly be facing five-figure debts, right? 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 more dollars that were just ruinous. And people went into bankruptcy to try to discharge as much of that as they could, or they went into bankruptcy because of other debts that they had. They would have their wages garnished. They would go hungry. Some folks even engaged in self-harm or practiced self-harm, all sorts of horrific things. Now, after advocates in Michigan had, made us think about this, multiple lawsuits, the state's attorney general, or inspector general rather, reviewed and found out that 93% of those allegations were false. So the state had falsely accused close to 40,000 people of UI fraud falsely. But the suffering had already happened by the time this happened, and the state had already dug in, and they didn't unwind their system. And that kind of stuff may be happening elsewhere. We saw something similar with identity verification algorithms during the pandemic, and I know California had a particularly interesting kind of experience with that. Now, AI is rendering hearing decisions on unemployment benefits in Nevada. Nevada just recently contracted with Google. It just implemented in the last few months, where AI is listening to the hearing and then rendering a decision. Now, the hearing officer is still there and can theoretically change the written decision and change the outcome. But the reason that the UI department turned towards this technology was because of backlogs. So how realistic do you think if they're overwhelmed by, unadjudicated claims and they're turning to AI to help them speed it through, how likely is it that those hearing officers are going to be reviewing things in depth and correcting them and really rendering thoughtful, considered decisions? To my mind, not very likely. So every aspect of public benefits administration, with work requirements now mandatory in Medicaid, uh, states are already talking about, or actually Republicans in particular in Congress were talking about turning to AI to manage those when they were trying to distinguish it from Arkansas's experience, which I was also involved in fighting, and AI is certainly not gonna help there. In housing, basically all low-income people who are, or many low-income people, I should say, sorry, not all, who are seeking housing are going to be exposed to AI in various ways. Tenant screening AI is a big one, right? And that basically what background check is now automated, takes data from more sources, gives a score to each tenant that applies. The landlord often defines what the cutoff is, so the score is usually determinative of whether or not to rent to somebody. There's usually no opportunity to provide further information or discussion. Oftentimes, the screening systems actually take information about other people. So you could have had somebody like, say, Kevin De Leon, just for an easy reference with somebody who has my name. Maybe my rental application wouldn't have information about Kevin De Liban. It might actually have information about Kevin De Leon. And so I might get denied an application based on what happened to the other person. Or it might take inaccurate information about me, right? Inaccurate criminal arrest or conviction records, inaccurate criminal arrest or conviction records, inaccurate eviction records, or other things to render the score. And the score isn't just based on my ability to pay rent. It's based on other things too. Have I ever been evicted? Am I likely to assert rights? Am I likely to ask the landlord for repairs? They try to factor all this in giving a score. It's also been used to set rents, where basically each landlord feeds in their information on their vacancies and the apartments that they're renting and the price they're paying into a central system that takes information from all the landlords that have submitted that and spits out recommended rents that then end up driving the prices higher in every place that they're used. And then, of course, surveillance, particularly for those of you who practiced in public housing. You know the role that surveillance has in terms of kicking people out of rent-controlled or public housing, subsidized housing, or if you're in a place with rent control, certainly rent-controlled housing. And so this is just amping up on that. In employment, so every aspect of hiring workers. So there's the same sort of worker screening systems as in place in the tenant field for employment. And again, they're not just taking into account whether or not you can do the job. They're taking into account whether you're likely to be a rabble rouser, assert your rights, try to improve working conditions, things like that. We know that AI is setting wages, most famously in sort of gig work, right? Uber and Lyft drivers and the various likes have no idea from one job to the next, even if it's the same job, the same length, the same time of day, they might not make the same amount of money. And many have compared it to going to a casino. Then you have surveilling and managing. Sometimes this is called bossware. And a lot of folks, the UC Berkeley Labor Center, Amazon warehouse workers, coalitions and organizing entities called the Athena Coalition and some others. NELP just put out a report about this yesterday, the National Employment Law Project. Bossware is what it's called, is ubiquitous, especially with low-wage workers. But it's coming for everybody too. Just last month, Amazon or the New York Times had a story about Amazon coders, right? Computer programmers who suddenly were facing AI-based performance metrics. And the whole article was about how so many of them hated it right? And it took all the dignity and the fun out of work. And these are the same people who coded the bossware for the warehouse workers, right? So it's coming full circle, and it certainly hit many people who beyond just low income or low wage workers. In K to 12 education, this is one that is particularly horrific. It predicts dropouts or, more perniciously, the likelihood of future criminality. So, one of the most disgusting stories I know of happened in Pasco, Florida, where the school district shared education records and social histories of their students with the local sheriff's department that ran that through algorithms to decide the likelihood of future criminality. Anybody who was identified as a likely future criminal, these are high school kids, right? And some were even middle school kids, was then terrorized. So the police or the sheriff would show up at all hours of day at their home, ask about where the kid was. If the kid wasn't at home, would try to go to wherever the kid might be. They would show up at parents' work at all hours of the day asking about the kid. Oftentimes, they wouldn't be doing anything specific. It would just be, where's your kid? What are you up to? Are you getting into any trouble? What is this? Right? Keeping eyes on them at all times. And then if the sheriffs determined that the family wasn't being cooperative, they would cite them for things like lawn violations, right? Pasco had a law that your lawn could only be an inch high or whatever it was. If you were 1/10 of an inch over, you got cited. And one sheriff's deputy testified in a deposition that the goal was to get people to either move or to sue. Um, and so that was, again, a horrific example that has been replicated elsewhere and is present in some form in as many as 50% of schools, public schools. Many higher in schools that predominantly serve low-income folks, or in schools or settings where there are greater numbers of kids with disabilities. Language access. I always mention this because one, I don't know that language access gets enough recognition as important even within our own programs. I don't think she's here, but shout out to Joanne Lee of LAFLA, who is an amazing language access advocate and has taught me so much. But we struggle this internally in many legal aids I know, and certainly government agencies struggle with this in that they don't provide meaningful language access to many members of the public, and they're turning to AI for automated translation and interpretation. And oftentimes, that kind of stuff is fine when you're trying to talk with a family member in a distant country who speaks a language that you don't. I have relatives in Austria that speak German, right? Okay, if I want to talk to my great aunt and say, "How are you doing? It's nice to talk with you," fine, right? But it's absolutely not appropriate for conveying sensitive medical or legal information that are going to be determining somebody's life or future or health or anything else like that. Domestic violence. This is an interesting one in that it manifests in a lot of ways. Some sheriff's department or police departments, law enforcement, I should say, are using it to assess the risk of violence for an eligibility for like increased attention or, things like this. The evidence from the US about this isn't super extensive. In Spain, they did it, and it was very problematic in the sense that many of and it was, almost 100% women who were murdered as a result of interpartner violence in Spain. Many of them were never assessed as the algorithm as a high likelihood of facing additional violence. So, right, in terms of structuring how we're going to pay attention, how we're going to devote limited societal resources, wasn't working very well in that example, and certainly is problematic, any use similar. But then deep fakes. This is really interesting. I did, again, a lot of domestic violence work, so I represented survivors in orders of protections and then sometimes in divorces or custody proceedings as a result. I didn't face this, but I've heard from my colleagues in other legal aid programs who are facing this, is deep fakes as coercion. So first of all, the abuser will threaten the survivor or the victim with a fake sex tape, for example, right? That depicts the survivor in a position of some sort of sexual act that they didn't actually engage in, and then threaten to release that to the broader public. And of course, no survivor is going to want to be explaining to their coworkers or the people they go to church with or anybody else that, hey, that wasn't me. Right? Or even if it was them in sort of a different take of that, right? But that's not AI. But then if you do file for an order of protection and manage to go forward, there's the possibility of the other side using deepfakes as evidence, right? In my experience, abusers would routinely, they had a few sets of arguments. One of them was, I didn't initiate it, it was the other person. Or um, it wasn't really a big deal, and that, you know, the person wasn't as hurt as they were claiming. So now you could use deepfakes um, to, and for those of you who don't know, deepfakes are, right, a audio or visual representation of something you said or did that you didn't actually say or do. It's all computer generated. They can use it to generate a video or audio recording where it sounds like the person who was abused initiated the confrontation. And in my experience, judges hated that. If that was the case, a lot of times the judge would say, well, they're not entitled to an order of protection. They started it. So you can see them using it as affirmative evidence. They also use it defensively when the other person, when the survivor presents evidence, text messages or videos or audio recordings of the abuser admitting it or saying, sorry, I went too far, or, you know, showing pictures of bruises or horrific physical injuries. Um, Abusers are now using it to call into question that evidence, saying, Your Honor, this is deepfakes. Um, it costs something like $10,000 to hire the technical expertise needed to determine whether or not something is a deepfake. And so for many of our clients who you know, don't have access to resources in part because of the dynamics of domestic violence, that's just out of reach, right? So you can see it in that way. And also you should know this doesn't require super sophisticated technology to create. For less than $1,000, $2,000 certainly, somebody could right now create a video of me saying that AI is the greatest thing in the world and that everybody should be adopting it, right? And most people in the public wouldn't be able to tell any difference. Obvious consequences also for democracy, but I'm not really talking as much about that right now. Child welfare, investigating neglect allegations. This is really important too. In most states, abuse allegations have to be investigated. But neglect is this fuzzy category, right? That oftentimes is just a proxy for poverty. You know, a mother or father or some family member who leaves an 8-year-old child unattended at home because there's no childcare. Well, if a neighbor or somebody else knows that that's happening, they might call, you know, the child welfare services and report neglect. So in some places, most famously in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is Pittsburgh, but also they've been toying around this in LA County, is then there is an AI-based system that will determine whether or not to investigate that given allegation of neglect. Now, it's not based at all on the severity of the allegation. It is just looking at the people involved. So if the parent was involved in the juvenile welfare system or the juvenile justice system as a kid, at one point, whether or not the parent was on Medicaid was a factor that weighed towards investigation. Mental health crises, mental health histories, domestic violence involvement, all these factors go into whether or not to decide to investigate the allegation of neglect. And, you know, once that happens, it's just free reign based on caseworkers' experience and proclivities about what happens to the families. Certainly, I think all of us here, we don't like child abuse, don't like child neglect, want kids to be safe. But there are plenty of reported examples of, you know, loving parents who are struggling with financial precarity, who might have disabilities, who other things, where the door to having their kid removed from them was opened essentially by the AI system saying that they needed to be investigated for neglect on a given allegation. So those are a lot of the most prominent use cases in ways that would affect our client communities. There's also some that I'm not dealing with as much in consumer uses, and that's because one, we all know that like credit score is probably the most famous algorithm that's been around, and it has been for a long time. Um, but also because it's a little outside of my ken and my areas of expertise, and I know that other people who are deeper into the credit side of things have been working extensively on it. But you can imagine it showing up in lending decisions, the terms of credit, you know, things like this. So why is AI used in these contexts? On the left side, you'll see all the justifications, right? We're streamlining and making our operations more efficient. We're reducing subjectivity or human bias. And this is really important to acknowledge that the status quo is not always good, right? Like we know anybody in the public benefits world or in the child welfare world certainly knows there are racist caseworkers, right? That have been there that might do what they can to make a client's life difficult. And so AI comes in to say, well, look, humans are imperfect. They make imperfect decisions. AI offers cold, machine-based, reasoning free from human biases. We'll talk about why that isn't true, but that's one of the stated justifications. Improving customer service, particularly in kind of the public benefits or government context. But also we see plenty in private uses with like AI-based call centers or uh, things like that, chatbots. Rationally allocating scarce resources and preventing fraud and waste, which is, the dominant frame right now from the right wing folks, especially at a national level. But what are the frequently felt effects? One, you're shifting in administrative burdens and a loss of opportunity, right? You're shifting the risk of the system going wrong to the people who are subject to it, who are oftentimes in the least position to actually resist it, particularly at scale. You're embedding biases. AI, especially the more sophisticated kinds, run on data, and oftentimes those data sets don't either they don't reflect everybody. So, for example, disability is oftentimes chronically under-acknowledged, under-tracked, under-reported in data sets, or you're baking in really established biases that exist in the data, particularly disadvantaging mostly communities of color, for example, like Black folks because of a history of medical racism not being represented well in treatment data, and then that treatment data being used to determine who gets uh, a particular given treatment according to AI. And so since Black folks aren't as represented in the data, their complaints are not taken as seriously and they are not eligible for the treatment. That's one example. You get longer wait times and inaccurate info. Call centers oftentimes are unhelpful, even if you get through to them, or the person answering, if you get through to a human, doesn't provide you accurate info, in part because of how they're led or the lack of substantive expertise that might exist. Sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. Benefit cuts, erroneous terminations. Many of us saw something similar in Medicaid unwinding. If you work in Medicaid, right, everybody's eligibility across the country had to be redetermined, and most of the people cut off were done so for procedural reasons, not a decision that they were substantively ineligible. There may have been some overlap, but I know from my own representation of folks in Arkansas and my colleagues throughout the country that there were many, many, many eligible people who were terminated erroneously because of, essentially AI-related decisions. False allegations of fraud, which we discussed, and then exacerbating inequities and power imbalances. This is a really important point. It is landlords, government officials, employers. It's all people with power who are using these things and entrenching their power-making decisions through, in part, the opacity of the algorithm, not understanding how it works. Even if you not understanding that it's there, right? You might not even know AI is working. And then if you know AI is working, not understanding how it works or not being forced to justify how it works or why it's rational, just creates this sort of, objective veneer of objectivity that really doesn't translate or, stand up to scrutiny. And that's one of the big takeaways I want you guys to have from this is they are attempting to use AI as this cloak of rationality, right? This is helping us identify fraud. This is helping us rationally allocate benefits. This is making sure that the people who need services are just getting the amount they need and not any more. But whose objectivity is it? Because I follow this stuff and I'm not aware of any instance of AI decision making being introduced and people having expanded access to benefits or better housing opportunities or better employment opportunities with higher wages and more worker protections. Nah, it's just going the other way. So if it's just going on the other way, whose objectivity is it? Right? And I think that's a really important critique to keep in mind as you're engaging in any of this stuff, is whose objectivity is it? There's an expanded scale of risk, right? There is no unemployment insurance division in the United States that would ever have the staff power to accuse 40,000 people of fraud, right? Like it just doesn't happen. Like there's no staff for that. It would take years and years and years, maybe a century of like full-time work to accuse that many people of fraud. But you introduce AI and suddenly you got it. It systematizes unpredictability. I always like to point this out. As legal aid folks, you already understand how precarious our client community's lives are, right? Like a blown tire, an unexpected medical bill, a family member who needs help, an unanticipated school expense for a kid. Anything of these can really destabilize low-income folks. But when every aspect of life um, ends up being subjected to AI-based decision making, you never know when you're going to be in the AI's gaze. If you are in the gaze, you never know what the outcome is going to be or when you're going to have to fight it. And so it creates, I think it intensifies that kind of permanent precariousness and unpredictability that you have. I know I'm still in touch with some of my clients from Arkansas on the Medicaid home care program, and every yearly assessment is an exercise in abject terror, right? Because they lived it or they were aware of it and they have no idea how it's going to come out this next time, right? It is anxiety inducing, it is frightening, and that kind of thing is just, again, reproduced at scale through AI. It also fuels kind of endless data collection and invasions of privacy and the concentration of power that that provides. Up until the present moment, the people who most were concerned with data collection and privacy oftentimes were folks from communities who are overpoliced or over-surveilled, right? They know how information can be put together to, target people who shouldn't be targeted or to further criminalize people. Um, but otherwise, sometimes even there, the privacy message doesn't always resonate. Sometimes takes on a note of, oh, but it's helping, like this endless data collection is helping keeping us safer, right? But outside of even those contexts, it's very hard to talk to many people about privacy because it's like, why does it matter, right? Like, I'm not doing anything bad. Why does it matter if, Facebook can sell me more targeted ads or something, right? Or I get a different insurance commercial when I watch TV. I think now, though, the present moment illustrates the dangers perfectly well, which is that this kind of abduction regime of mostly Latino people, but other folks who might be present in some way that physically is tied to the notion of being an immigrant are being, systematically identified, abducted, disappeared, tortured, all these other things. And that's really being fueled by the ability of the federal government to aggregate data about them, even in ways that are illegal. Um, and then finally, the way that AI is different from humans or human-based decision making is it's harder to contest individually and systemically. And let me go into a little bit about that right now. Um, so AI defies all existing accountability structures, right? There are generally no consequences for either elected officials or the agency leadership that implement, destructive AI technologies. There just isn't the political um, disfavor to make that a risky decision for them in most states and circumstances. So there's very little political accountability for much of this presently. There's little market accountability, particularly with regards to government uses, because governments are going to turn to a handful of contractors, right? Deloitte, Accenture, Maximus, who are, pick your flavor, but there's only 3 or 4 places that do a lot of the kind of systems work that states are looking for. And so Deloitte, for example, has built systems that fail repeatedly in the same way in multiple states, but states don't sue them and the market doesn't punish them. Um, and so oftentimes that isn't a viable way of imposing any accountability. And then on the legal front, there's limited claims. The claims that you can get oftentimes don't have significant remedies, right? So due process claims, injunctive relief, great, not meaningless, right? Meaningful stuff, but doesn't carry the disincentive that money damages would also carry with it, right? And even though I have Pierce qualified immunity and think in the legal aid world that's an underused possibility, like you can't Pierce qualified immunity on every case, right? Um, and then, there's the civil rights decisions that keep paring back what damages are available. I think it happened most recently in the ADA and Rehab Act context where emotional distress damages were not sort of colorable remedy under I think it was Section 504 of the Rehab Act. You have, of course, all the discourse about the enforceability and private right of action. And then even if you get through all that stuff, you have just the raw capacity question of can low-income people get to an attorney who will represent them free of charge and has the capacity to take things on. And, I know as legal aid, we're always doing our best in the limited resources we have, but sometimes it's a real problem of even with people who know to come to us, let alone those who don't. Um, so it really defies accountability structures in every way. And that's why, and I'm sure somebody will have this question, people will often ask me, well, what about AI's potential for good? And my answer is always like, because of this, when it comes to low income people, stuff just doesn't work for low income people, and the incentives aren't there for things to work for low income people. So even when you talk about theoretical uses of AI for good, and I'm happy to discuss that if y'all are interested, um, you're just not going to get something that practically translates on the ground because of these incentive structures. Advocacy challenges. Really difficult to know that AI is being used. We have a guide. I'm going to go over a little bit of it, but we have a guide that it's general purpose. It's trying to cover multiple issue areas, but it gives you a sense of things to look for to figure out if AI is being used or not. If you figure out it's used, it's difficult to know how it works. And there's two aspects to it, the mechanical and the statistical. To give you an example, the Arkansas example that I fought, people were asked 286 questions. Of those 286 questions, 60 mattered. Okay, and I had to figure that out just from seeing, I have no background in statistics, no background in computer programming, no background in math. But because I had so many assessments and then I eventually got the actual computer code of the algorithm, I could tell you which 60 of those 286 mattered. And if you gave me an assessment, I could tell you with these given inputs, here's where somebody should come out. So I understood the mechanics of the algorithm. I understood what inputs lead to what outputs. But I still did not understand why those inputs were chosen as opposed to others. Why were those inputs determined as being relevant to a measure of somebody's need, medical need for home caregiving services? And some of those were really irrational. I started keeping a list of what I called algorithmic absurdities. So for example, there was a point system, right? Where if you were totally dependent on someone for assistance getting off the toilet, you were rated, say, a 7, right? And if you needed no assistance, you were rated a 0. So if a nurse rated you 1 point difference, say between a 4 and a 5, on one question out of 286, that could be the difference in 1.5 or 2 hours a day of care. Simply 1 point. That doesn't make any sense, right? Or whether a nurse determines that your pressure score is a 2 instead of a 1, several hours of difference. Whether or not you vomited or had diarrhea in the last 3 days. If so, more hours. If not, fewer hours. What if you vomited or had diarrhea 4 days ago or 5 days ago? It becomes pure chance of when the assessor came out. And why does that matter? We're talking about ongoing care needs. Why does how recently you had diarrhea or vomiting factor into that at all? So the statistical underpinnings of how the AI works was totally irrational, made no sense. But if you're challenging it, that's an important thing to know. If you're subjected to that, that's an important thing to know. Why am I getting my hours cut? Why does that thing matter? And that's a really difficult advocacy challenge. Sometimes it's difficult to track the scale of the harm. In the sense is you don't necessarily know how many people are subject to a given AI, especially if they themselves don't know that they're subject to it. So it can be hard to kind of get a handle on the problem. There's a question of, is it a tech problem, a policy problem, or both? And the best way to answer this is, if I make the technology better, does the policy, are people better off? Does the policy problem go away? And oftentimes we conflate those two. So it's just important to keep in mind that it can be both, and that even when you're devising a solution to what might be a technological problem, you may not want to define it as such because you don't want the answer to just be a technical fix. An example of this, again, in Arkansas, the algorithm, as it worked, reduced everybody's hours, right? But there were a couple ways where the algorithm was broken in that it wasn't coded and operationalized as it was intended to work. So if you had cerebral palsy or diabetes, you were generally benefited. You got in a group that provided more hours. Well, the state's code was broken so that it didn't recognize cerebral palsy or diabetes. And so people systematically got fewer hours than they should have. What they should have gotten was a problem, though, right? But the broken algorithm story would sometimes overtake the real story, which is that the algorithm is breaking people's lives, right? So you've got to think about, does this kind of problem call for a technological solution, a policy solution, or both? And also, it's really difficult to know how to fight back and then to build multidimensional responses. And one of the aspects that we emphasize in Arkansas, that I emphasize always at Tectonic Justice, is you can't just think in terms of the law, right? You need to be thinking in terms of organizing to the extent you can, public education, community activation, narrative strategy, art, other things that'll help you coalesce energy into a force for change that wins something hopefully that is enduring. Um, and that's a tough thing to do, right? Like, we're not necessarily trained that way in law school. There are all sorts of problematic dynamics that we learn with respect to who has knowledge, who's an expert, how should our relationships with clients work, who's in charge, how do we relate to community, right? Those are challenging issues for us just normally, I think, in the legal aid world, at least for many of us. And so when you're trying to apply it to a new area like AI, it's there, and it's there even more presently because you have to fight multidimensionally to have any chance of success. Um, Quickly want to address some of the other concerns with AI just beyond the uses. The concentrations of corporate power and the consequences for politics. We're seeing this now with some of what's been referred to already. Also, in the reconciliation bill, it was stripped out by the Senate at the end, but there was the very real threat that they were federally going to preempt any state or city-based regulation of AI, right? So the notion is that states couldn't even protect their citizens from whether it would be, non-consensual sexual material and like generated stuff, whether it would be because of automated decision making or employment practices or the rent manipulation algorithms, whatever. That was really close to passing, and it's going to come back. So you see what the consequences are for politics when big tech in particular is in bed with the decision makers. Environmental degradation, there are new evidence, new studies, new information coming out every day. AI runs on data. That data has to be processed somewhere. It is processed in places called data centers, which are these huge facilities with big servers that require incredible power and oftentimes water. So it's been correlated with the cost, increased prices of electricity in communities where data centers have expanded rapidly. Also, they require an immense amount of water to cool them. And sometimes this water is coming from places that don't have much of it. And there are various other environmental aspects of AI to note too. Those are just some of the ones that are most prominent. Eroding privacy and nonstop surveillance, labor exploitation. AI depends on people oftentimes in, like, say, Kenya or the Philippines to view horrific data and label it as this is abusive, this is torture, this is, or something simpler. This is a cat, this is a car, whatever. But oftentimes those labelers work in really bad working conditions. You have, of course, the theft of visual art and books and everything else that the large language models like ChatGPT are trained on. It's also flatly inaccurate for many uses, including transcription uses. So medical transcription, a lot of doctors are using it in their practices, and it creates it records that people said things that they didn't actually say. And you know how bad that is once that gets into medical records. That can be impossible to remove. Also, there's the democracy aspects of concerns with AI, right? Misinformation and disinformation, and how easy it is to spread falsehoods, how easy it is to depict people doing things that they didn't actually do or say things they didn't actually say. With that said, we got a few minutes left of me presenting before we turn to questions. I want to tune you all into this survey right now. Please do it. We don't do anything bad with your data. Okay, I promise you. I promise you. You can trust me. It helps us. We use this for grant reporting purposes. It helps us understand what you learned, what would have been better. It lets you know if you want to sign up for our newsletter, which you can definitely say no to, or you can opt out of at any time. It asks a few other questions if you're aware of anything AI related going on and whether there are any community groups you might want us to speak to or you think would benefit from that. So please go ahead and take the survey if you can before you leave today. It's much appreciated and really helps us be able to establish the value of what we're doing. If you find it valuable, and if you don't find it valuable, that's also helpful. Just be kind when you tell us that, please. But be honest but kind. What we do is tectonic justice trainings. You all have gotten the first part of it, right? For legal aid, for social services, for affected community members, for other kinds of advocates like the children and family advocates that exist in every state, or the budget advocates, or the other folks, the hunger relief advocates, policymakers, judges. We've trained them all. We do train them all. They get some variation of this part one training. We also can do a part two training where we oftentimes use scenarios and get deeper into helping you as an advocate develop your critique, your issue spotting, and start creatively brainstorming around those multidimensional responses. So always happy to do an in-depth part two if that's of interest. We help provide technical assistance across these multiple dimensions. So you come to us with like, hey, I think the state might be using AI for such and such, or I'm organizing with some tenants and I suspect AI might be happening. What do I do about it? And then, I'll put my brain to it. I'll bring my partner at Tectonic Justice, who is a community organizer, into it. Maybe we'll bring in one of the national centers if it's a Medicaid thing or a consumer thing, and provide like really in-depth strategic assistance that can be ongoing. It's not just a one-off conversation. It's really what you would find useful for you and your work. Eventually, as resources allow, we'll get directly involved in litigation campaigns. Until 3 months ago, it was just me. I love to sue people, but I also am trying to get an organization off the ground from scratch. So as we get more resources, we'll get directly involved in some fights. Working on ground up community engagement and organizing in a few different target states. We're just about to start that more intentionally. And then a lot of public education, right? Conferences, developing useful resources for advocates and for broader members of the public, and doing lots of media. Normally, especially coming from a legal aid background where you're like helping people solve real problems and materially improve their life, I sometimes in the past have been, skeptical of the value of another media appearance. But here, and conferences here where it feels like so few people understand that AI is so harmful in so many ways to our clients' lives, it feel like it does add value. So we also lean in really heavily on the public education, especially since there's sort of a moment. Here's 2 pages of the tips to identifying AI use. It's a 4 or 5 page document. The link is in the PowerPoint, and also during the chat, I can throw it in. It's up on our website too, if you just go to Tectonic Justice. So it gives you like tips, words, things to look for, physical signs, what you can do, how to investigate, what your rights might be in different situations. So again, a practical guide to help you identify. A lot of the key is really in the first page. Paperwork or like words that people use, and then like weird happenings. So if you apply for a job and are rejected within a couple minutes, great chance that AI was involved, right? If you apply for housing and you're rejected within a couple minutes, great chance AI was involved. But excuse me, because it's so invisible in many cases, you have to kind of piece together things. Now we have a guide for organizations that are considering AI. My remit is not helping the legal aid world avoid terrible decisions. Like there's enough that's affecting our client communities from people with power that I haven't been focused so much on like, oh, which legal aid technology might help us do more with less or solve the justice gap or these other so-called promises. But I've heard enough from enough people that are like, we're going to adopt AI for this, that, or the other. And I'm super skeptical. So we put together a guide. It'll be coming out in the next couple weeks. Pretty with a structured thought process for you to potentially use in your organizations to think, if we're turning to AI for something, is that something we really want to do? And if we do we really come out ahead in terms of the resources that we'll need to spend to implement and oversee it versus what it might cost us in those same resources? So that's forthcoming. Another reason to, sign up to our listserv, stay up with what we're doing. what's the way forward? And really, I want to, return to hope, right? This is coming, like it's here, right? And it's already devastating people at mass scales. We help people survive first. That's the important thing. In legal aid, all of us in the legal aid world are positioned to try to help people do that, survive and understand what's happening, through legal support, social services, mutual aid, et cetera. Then using that understanding to organize, engage, and build power. And the thing here we have is that people already really mistrust AI and big tech. Every poll shows that. And right now, it's not a purely political issue. And again, I've said things that I think are accurate reflections of politics today. But it's an important thing to note that AI isn't left or right coded, right? And I think as long as that's true, there's real opportunity to build some coalitions with people who might not otherwise align if you just talk about it from whatever the substantive perspective is. Educating and narrating. We at every point have to make it clear that AI is an illegitimate way to make at least these core life decisions. I firmly believe that, and it needs to be said because on the other side is inevitability. The train has left the station. The animal has left the barn. It's here to stay. We just need guardrails. I think that's an unwise approach for a couple reasons. Um, One is I don't think it's true. I don't think AI is inevitable. Two, you've got an industry that exists with billions and billions of dollars being put behind that message. They don't need us to make that for them. And three, it's not a very motivating message to have people come out, hey, guardrails, let's turn out for guardrails. Nah, like you want to have people know, let's turn out for justice. We want a world in which we have access to housing, we have healthcare, we have good jobs and fair work. And AI is getting in the way of that, right? And it's not a legitimate way of doing things. We have this window now before this technology becomes entrenched as and accepted as a legitimate way to make decisions, to fight it. And if we don't fight like hell now, we're going to be stuck with it for a much longer period. And along with that is the positive vision of like what we actually want and what technology's role is in the world in which we want. We see something that's more just. So with that, there's the other survey link. I'm going to leave this up for a little bit. There are some resources we have, again, up on our website at tectonicjustice.org. Also, earlier I mentioned the or I mentioned the National Health Law Program and Upturn. Myself and Help and Upturn came together a few years ago to collaborate on something called the Benefits Tech Advocacy Hub, btah.org. We have bunches of resources for advocates and for people fighting this in the public benefits realm. Everything from how to do a FOIA to try to get at an AI or algorithmic system that the government might be using, to how to do community engagement and media strategies, like kind of introductory materials on that front. So please go and use the resources. Feel also free to email me. Like I'm really happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk about this and to help you. Like this is why I'm here, right? Like it's hard to leave legal aid where you're in the battle every day, and I loved it. Like I love my clients, I love suing people, and even as I was in a management role, I loved being in a place to shape how that was happening. And so to do this, to be a little bit more disconnected from that sometimes feels weird, but at the same time, I'm 100% convinced that this is the battle kind of our day, and that if we don't fight this, everything else ends up being that much harder. So if you show the least bit of interest in me, I'll be like, this is wonderful. Let's talk. My schedule sometimes is a little rough, but we'll always find time. And so that's Tectonic Justice. That's me. That's our presentation. I'm going to exit out of this and then actually, no, I'll leave the survey link up, and then I would love to field questions from folks. And thank you so much for rolling with me today, and really excited to keep conversing. All right, so let me see. There is the chat. And Yoselin, I don't know, how do you like to do this? Do you
I can read
do,
them out to you from the Q&A if that's okay.
sure, that'd be fantastic, please.
All right. The first one says, is there any indication that housing authorities are using AI for any type of screening?
Housing authorities themselves, I am not sure. I know they're using it for surveillance of tenants. For screening, I am not sure. I do know that Section 8, landlords who accept Section 8 definitely do. And I think there's easy ways, not easy, none of this is easy. There are ways to find out though, right? With housing authorities in most states, they're subject to FOIA or whatever your Freedom of Information law is called. And there would be ways to target searches to try to find that out and then find details of how they're using it and kind of what the impact is. And I would be happy to help anybody who is really interested in doing that.
Next one says, isn't eliminating biases not possible? If it's human created, it has human biases, is my understanding.
Uh, broadly, yes. But there are some sophisticated technical techniques that computer programmers who are trying to de-bias data use. And I'm not super versed in all of the intricacies of it, but it's like they're trying to see, can they identify where the data comes from, at least in important demographics? How about, even if the demographic isn't given, so like demographics by proxy, and then how do we control for that? How representative of that? Is there some way to crosswalk what we know with what we don't know and like do all this in terms of debiasing data sets? So there is that. I think the question though is to what extent does that translate into meaningfully better outcomes for people to have debiased data? And I think a lot of my point is like, sure, debias your data, but if ultimately what you're doing is using an unbiased algorithm to make decisions, you're still going to cause harm, right? And that's actually another really important part of the discourse is that AI related harm has been framed so much in terms of bias and discrimination. I take issue with that. Bias and discrimination is wrong. It is one form of harm and needs to be dealt with and accounted for. But you can build unbiased algorithms, at least unbiased in a legal sense, that still devastate people's lives. For example, in Arkansas, if your approach to solving AI harms is just limited to bias, you are not going to get at so many other aspects of the harm. So conceptually, it doesn't fit. Also, operationally, it doesn't fit. I've litigated employment discrimination cases, right? Direct discrimination, not disparate impact. Those are hard enough. Direct discrimination is really hard enough. Disparate impact, like with all the stuff that you need to know up front to survive motions to dismiss, like that's not something that we can operationalize at a scale that is needed for the size and scope of AI related harms. So I'm really glad for that question about bias because it's important to highlight kind of in the bigger picture. Yes, bias is awful, wrong. We should address it. But framing AI harms strictly in terms of bias is, I don't think, a winning frame or strategy for meaningful systemic success.
Amy's asking if they can access the survey without using the QR code. I was thinking we could add it to the Dropbox link if that's
Yes,
yeah.
yes, 100%, 100%. Thank you. And
Uh,
I appreciate somebody sensitive to like scanning QR codes randomly.
Someone else said, I have heard some folks say that the blanket statement that AI is harmful in all aspects. What are your thoughts?
AI for decision-making purposes has not been used, to my knowledge, for poor people in a way that is beneficial at any scale or scope comparable to its harms, right? Um, there are theoretical uses of AI for good, um, for decision-making purposes. The main one would be public benefits eligibility, right? The idea being that the government should know for most of us, what our income is, maybe what our assets are, and could identify, hey, you're likely to be eligible for public benefits. Go ahead and apply. Or you are eligible for benefits. Let's just enroll you and automatically re-enroll you every year, your renewals. The problem is because of the structural factors I identified earlier, we haven't seen any of that translate for the most part into real promise at scale. You get some projects that are less than statewide, that are less than like full integrated systems into a state's benefits eligibility determination system that show some promise, but not really at the scale. And then there's a question of efficiencies on the back end, right? Can you help overburdened caseworkers do more with what they currently have? On those efficiency-based uses that are not decision making, I don't have as much beef with them. I think there's still the concern about, is it a net positive once you factor in all the externalities, the environmental costs, the human costs, you know, all of those things. Um, but I'm not necessarily against them. There, I always ask the question though of, is the increased capacity going back to the public meaningfully? Because in many of the situations I'm aware of, even in some blue states, if you get additional staff capacity from technology, it's not that you get to keep the same number of staff and keep that extra technology enabled efficiencies. It's that now you need fewer staff, and so they just cut back, right? And so even those places where there are alleged efficiencies, it's not necessarily true that it ends up being a net benefit, kind of to the public or the people we serve. And the evidence from the private sector also on AI efficiencies is really interesting in that many private sector entities that adopted AI early have backed off that and said it's not really creating much efficiency. If anything, it's creating more work, or people are unsure of how they do their work, or they're having to double check the AI's work because the AI itself is so unreliable. So yeah, those efficiencies things are tricky. And the last thing I'll say about AI for good is people always like to point out, and not people as in folks here, it's like industry always likes to point out, oh, AI is going to solve cancer, right? First of all, it's a long way from doing anything that grand, right? So let's pump the brakes, y'all, right? Second of all, if it is capable of doing something that grand, does it require all this environmentally destructive, privacy destructive, humanity destructive technology to do it? Or can you use some version of AI, like some sort of advanced machine learning model that doesn't require, all of these devastating side impacts to do that thing? And then thirdly, even if you can get there, are people going to have insurance to get their cancer treated? Right? Right. And right now, that the answer to that question is not a definite yes. Particularly, and even if you have insurance, AI is being used to determine prior authorization, right? To determine whether or not you can get a treatment that your doctor has said is medically necessary. And so even when you get into the AI for good conversations, you have a whole host of other complications that really make it so that that isn't necessarily a given. So I don't know if I'm answering your question in good faith, but I'm certainly happy to hear follow up if that's not a satisfying answer.
Someone else said, maybe I misheard you, but you said you have only heard about the harms caused by algorithms, which were primarily specific examples of loss of benefits to individuals, but you have no data on efficiencies or improvements these programs might bring to public benefits administration. Have you looked or done research for this data? Is it not there, or have you just not looked for it?
Hopefully, my answer to the last question really took that question, I think, head on. If there's something more that you would want to know, Paul, I'm happy to follow up. The Public Benefits Administration stuff, uh, yeah, again, there's kind of the question of what efficiencies it's actually offering. Is it in the end efficient? And if it is it worth the kind of consequences in terms of environmental stuff, data privacy stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's still that question of, if you create efficiencies, is it really going to go back and serve the public? Or, as is the case in many of the states and environments I've been exposed to, is it just going to justify decreasing staffing levels and trusting that the AI is going to get you to the previous level of capacity that you had?
Someone else is asking, how can people vet AI for algorithmic discrimination? Are any entities working to hold AI accountable?
Sure, sure. I mean, we're one of those entities. Um, we don't have the capacity right now to vet necessarily AI for discrimination from a technical aspect, although certainly we could help suss it out. But yes, we have like close working relationships with statistical scientists, computer scientists who would be absolutely thrilled to have a real life example of possible AI discrimination to work on. And if we're talking about AI harms broader than discrimination, something that doesn't necessarily require the like deep level disparate impact kind of data-driven analysis, even more so. So definitely yes. I think the key would be to just reach out, let me know what you're working on or what you're curious about, and we can figure out how we can help.
And then they said, what about the bias for disability, specifically the failure to accommodate for disability? Where different treatment is required?
Yeah, this is an underexplored area just generally, and one of my colleagues named Ariana Abulafia has been really working hard to note the underrepresentation of disability in kind of the bigger AI justice, algorithmic justice context. Um, but yeah, I mean, like so many of these systems are normed for some sort of average user, and average usually defined as abled, right? And not disabled. And so disabled folks are underrepresented oftentimes in data sets and oftentimes not accounted for in the application of any of these technologies. Um, so that is a definite, like, it's one of the most problematic aspects of kind of ongoing AI use in that it doesn't work for a lot of people with disabilities for one reason or another.
They also said, I have not seen an answer anywhere for how to effectively detect slash counter bias in the failure to accommodate slash provide different treatment for people with disabilities. It's a crucial part of addressing disability-based bias.
In this context, the way I'm mostly familiar with it, and I really appreciate, yeah, thank you, Aisha. Um, the questions is oftentimes this comes up in eligibility system discussions. So our friends at NHELP and the Tennessee Justice Center recently litigated a case in Tennessee about Tennessee's eligibility and enrollment system. And they got a victory on the merits that it was discriminating against people with disabilities because there wasn't a way for people to access the application in accessible ways or to talk with people to provide an accessible pathway to an eligibility application and decision. I don't remember the specific circumstances of what the barriers were, but I've seen that fact pattern in other eligibility system cases on the public benefits front. Um, I don't know as much on the application front. You can imagine in both tenant screening and employment screening applications having similar disability accessibility problems, right? With whether it's verbiage, whether it's contrast ratio, whether it's kind of ability to understand and comprehension. You can imagine all those kind of screening systems having some significant accommodations related problems.
Someone else is asking, where does environmental impact fit into litigation, if at all? Not only does AI harm decision making, but its water and resource consumption is devastating. Can you speak to how that fits into this conversation?
Yes, this is great, by the way. Um, so if I'm litigating it in the context of like benefits cut or whatever, the environmental impact may not make it into litigation at all. But it could be part of the multidimensional response, right? If you're thinking about how is this particular AI system working? Is it manifesting in the use of some sort of, is there a data center nearby that might matter? And how can we do this? So one example, this isn't benefits related, but in Memphis right now, Elon Musk has tried to build, and I lived in Memphis when I was working in Arkansas much of the time. It's just across the river. Elon Musk is trying to build this supercomputer in Memphis that's using dirty energy in a predominantly black neighborhood that has the highest rates of asthma and respiratory diseases in the country, right? Um, and so um, this is a major issue right now, and there's a lot of community organizing going about resisting this. The fact of the matter is that local leaders have been allured by the prospect of jobs from the data center. Now, usually the jobs are not as extensive or as lucrative as claimed, right? But they've approved it. Now, one of the ways you could see it in advocacy, and I think there are some organizations in California that do more of this than we did in Arkansas, is land use and zoning fights. So you could know that a data center was being built in your community and then go to the mats through the zoning process about it, making sure it doesn't get the zoning or the permitting needed for it, organizing the community. It's like data center fights are actually really set up to be good organizing opportunities. And there are some guides out there and some work, like really smart people who have been doing a lot of thinking on that. Whether that data center is going to be used in ways that directly harm your clients is the question, right? Like tying data center to like, you can't tie like a given data center probably to a given use. So you'd have to think a little bit more about how that connected, but that's one way that comes up.
And it looks like the last one's a follow-up from Paul. They said, I asked this thought experiment as a formal legal aid, helping clients fight denials. Would you rather have the following reviewing your client's public benefits application? One, an algorithm that you got to help design and or review for fairness, or two, the county employee who you overheard making sexist, racist, classist comments in the hallway the last time you saw them in an administrative hearing.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. Number two, without a doubt, I don't blink twice. To give you an example, when we would in the Medicaid context, when we would have administrative hearings over whether or not somebody's benefits cut was appropriate, I would have to prove that the AI system had incorrect information at the time it was input. So we're talking about medical need. I would present evidence like, oh, my client takes 2 hours to get out of bed and shower, right, as an example. And I could put on evidence from the client. I could talk to his caregiver or her caregiver. I could talk to a doctor that said, oh, yeah, this is consistent with their needs. And the hearing officer would either exclude that evidence as irrelevant or discount it essentially as irrelevant because the only issue was were the inputs correct at the time they were inputted? And if not, all we would get was a new assessment, right? And so the field of fighting, like the criteria had been totally displaced from medical need to just what the algorithm decided. But beyond that, like, why do I want to have to take on an AI and prove how it works and why it works that way and that it's irrational? And then all I can do is cross-examine a nurse about what their experience was as inputting the data. I would much rather cross-examine that nurse about, look, what are your other decisions? Right? I heard you say something racist. Do you deny saying that? Do you deny that that affected your decision here? I can open up other questions about them and various other things. I can justify, wait, you gave this person over here this many hours, you gave this person this many hours, or you approved their application, you denied their application. What accounts for the difference? It still may not lead to a wholly satisfying outcome, but it is much easier to actually operationalize, the in-depth examination of the credibility of a person as it is opposed to an AI system or even a person that's relying on an AI system to inform their decision. So a human 100% of the time and twice on Sunday. I see I added a comment in the chat. Sabrina, not a question, just a statement. It's incredibly disheartening to hear about the targeting young people and causing law enforcement to track them down for no reason. That's hard to hear. Yeah, I am very sorry. I mean, now I've told the story enough times that maybe my facial expressions and my tone of voice don't indicate fully the amount of shock and disgust I feel, but that is one of the particularly disgusting um, uses. Um, and the response to it. It took so much advocacy work on the part of the local folks who resisted it to get rid of that, um, and for such a clearly heinous use. Any other questions or comments or anything else people would like me to know or would like to hear more about in the future? And while you think of those, I know there's been some folks who've dropped comments in the chat. Please do follow up with me if you've said that or if I'm interesting to you or anything we talk about is interesting. Would really love to continue the conversations. And if you all are connected to any community groups that you think would benefit from this, I have a version of that that delves less into like the legal specificities and is much more, is more accessible. I think a lot of what we talk about is the same, but I can adjust the presentation to any kind of group you're interested in, whether they're other professional advocates, whether they're um, non-professional advocates, right, and community advocates and community leaders. However that might be, always happy to do anything I can for anybody here. So please just let me know. And thank you to Yoselin and to Kasha for inviting and organizing this. I really appreciate all their work. They made it super easy too. So I'm grateful very much for y'all's work on that front.